I'm afraid I'm going to speak from a very institutional viewpoint. And just to make things clear, there are a lot of initiatives developed by the French government that go alongside what Mélanie's been saying. And as you can maybe hear in the presentation of her, of her bio, she did receive recognition from the French state. So it's not as if it was a completely rebel situation and completely contradictory to the general situation. I was planning to speak in a very formal way about the question of repatriation and art objects, but the current situation in France forced me to change my discourse a little bit, and I'm going to be maybe much more informal than I was planning to be. I'm saying that because, as you know, in 2017, in November, if I'm not mistaken, the French president, Macron, gave a speech in Ouagadougou where he spoke about the fact that it was necessary to think about restitution, and he said permanent or temporary, of African artifacts belonging to French museums to their, and again I quote, original territories in less than 5 years. He then commissioned two experts, or experts might not be the right word, I'll come back to that afterwards, and it's interesting also, I think, in itself. Two persons, Bénédicte Savoy, who's been working on French-German relationships at the beginning of the 19th century, basically focusing on how French armies looted a lot of artworks from Germany, but also how a lot of artists circulated between the two countries. And Felwine Sarr, a Senegalese professor who's not an art historian and has been working on literature and various other fields. And these two are just handing back their report to the French president this very afternoon. It's supposed to happen at 6 p.m. French time. So it's difficult for me, in a way, to speak about something about which I don't know the conclusions of. But as I'm on the institutional side, maybe I'll try to speak from this viewpoint in a way and not try to speak for the others. You might have read what the report is actually coming to. Basically, what the report focuses on is the fact that 90% of the African heritage, and again, this is a notion we should work with and work against in a way, are outside of Africa. So it's the same kind of situation that Marion described for the Philippines, and the rest applies of your 5 points, or I don't remember whether they were 5 points, apply, of course, to that. With around 90,000 objects in French museums. As the head of the National Institute for Art History in France, I don't know how they came up with this figure, but that's interesting in itself. I mean, let's say it's about that kind of figure, because we are working on different programs to identify the objects in French collections, and it's a very long process, and we still don't know how many of them there are, because of the way they are in various situations, in various collections, sometimes not identified, and most of the time, as you know, not identified specifically in terms of dates, in terms of provenance, in terms of how they came to the current museums. The conclusion of the report is pretty radical. It's basically that, I quote the report in the English version, unless there is explicit evidence or information witnessing the full consent of the part of the owners or initial guardians of the objects at the moment when the objects were separated from them, all African objects in French museums should be returned to their countries of origins. One thing in passing, if you don't know how the work came to France, how do you know where it originates from, completely without any art historical study or any provenance research that's going to be more clear on what's happening. And I'm not, I mean, this is, I'm not going on the same, I'm not going to challenge the report on this kind of ideological level that they took. I'm just pointing a few problems somewhere. So it means that not only the objects that have been looted in military operations, like the one that happened under General Alfred Dodds in 1892 in the Abomey Palace of the Dahomey Kingdom, now part of the country of Benin, with these statues that are very well known and have been displayed a lot in French museums. They first appeared at the Musée de l'Homme and then were transferred to Musée du Quai Branly-Jacques Chirac when it was created. So not only these looted objects should be, according to Bénédicte Savoy and Felwine Sarr, repatriated to Benin, and that's a very clear thing. It's something that was stolen in a military action and stolen not from private hands, but from state-like organizations. So it's pretty clear. The idea is to repatriate everything also that was collected by, and again, it's the same words, by civil administrators and colonial administrators, scientific expeditions, missionaries, and all that. Presuming that everybody is guilty in principle, unless demonstrated innocent, which is legally a strange idea. But I mean, if we start to apply this to civil law, I think there's going to be a lot of problem for a lot of people. And that I know it is the current tendency, but I do think that there's a problem when you think that you have to be proven innocent and not proven guilty. But again, and they, I mean, that is their idea for anything that came into French Museum between 1885 and 1960, which they take as the date of independence for the African states. And maybe let me remind you that Djibouti, who was the last decolonized state in Africa, was given independence or seized its independence from France only in 1977. So even the date is somehow inaccurate. And I think that we have to go beyond the kind of feeling of immediate response in terms of feeling to this kind of very generous and general ideas that we have when facing these kind of situations. And that's why I'm insisting. And I feel like I act like the bad male white. I have all the symbols and symptoms of what's worse when speaking as an art historian. Male white, aristocratic, French, American-born. I don't know what I can add. I mean, I don't know. My mother is Norwegian, so it's Northern European. I mean, everything's wrong. I know that. But nevertheless, I'm still saying the things I think need to be said. And again, repatriation, as advocated by these two people, one of them is actually a close friend, but that's another thing. We've been fighting and arguing pretty much for the past 2 weeks, but that's okay. All of that should be repatriated, I quote again, in a swift and thorough manner without any supplementary research regarding their provenance or origins of any objects taken by force or presumed to be acquired through inequitable condition. Okay, again, I'm not... all that being, done with the idea, and I do agree completely with the idea that it's none of our business as French, because the thing is a governmental report, or at least commissioned by the government and paid for by the government report. It's none of our business as French state to consider how the objects are going to be taken care of in the countries where they're going to be repatriated. So I don't know what the actual decision by the French president is going to be. It can be many different things, and I've been speaking with various people these past week or these past 10 days about what can be a response from the president. The fact that everything has been divulgated before the report was actually handed over to the president could make things much worse than any other thing. It could make everybody feel important and having said the right things, but in the end, I think that what counts, at least to me, and that's maybe why I'm an art historian, but also dealing with institutions, is what finally happens in terms of actual decision making. And I don't know, again, what is going to happen. What I can say is that there's a general consensus in France about various things. Some things are, when you're saying that there's a general consensus, you always can find oppositional voices on various aspects. The first one would be, and I'm sorry to use these words, but I've been waiting for other words, other better words to come that can be used generally. The first one is the general consensus, or at least for a majority of people in France, that France is now a multicultural country. Pluricultural, I don't know, you call it as you want, but in France it means something very clear, because France has been an incredibly centralized country since the 17th century, forcing all its inhabitants to have only one language and forbidding the use of any regional language from the 17th century onward, and implementing it completely at the end of the 19th century, having all the resources going to Paris, including artistic resources, and I'll come back to that afterwards. And so that's one aspect. Second aspect, there's a general consensus, at least amongst the museum directors, museum curators, art historians, and all that some things can be returned or have to be returned. There have been examples before the African art objects. The Korean manuscripts that were returned to South Korea in 2001, the whole judiciary process has been extremely complicated because, as you may know, there's a law in France which maintains that all objects that once enter a museum, a public museum, are then unalienable, which means that they cannot be sold or they cannot be given away, which means that they become heritage in the sense that they have to be preserved by the French state, and that it's impossible to part away with them. So that's why the process was quite complicated, and I think quite, inadequate for the Korean manuscript. It had more to do with the fact that France at the time wanted to sell a fast train to South Korea than anything else. Because all of this is also entangled into that kind of a very concrete international relationship history. Second consensus is the fact that human remains, when they are claimed, should be given back. And that happened with several South Pacific remains that were returned to New Zealand. And it's always interesting in terms of how France see its colonial not past, not future, but present, that usually when people are giving these lists of objects that were returned, they include one head that was returned to Neo Caledonia, which is supposedly not a colony, but part of France. Even if, and they've just had a referendum where the majority of the population voted for staying inside France. But that shows the complexity of the situation. I think that, and maybe the report is going to change that, I don't know, that there's a general consensus which is very, very recent and linked with the Ouagadougou Declaration by the President among art historians and curators that things that have been looted in Africa or in colonial situation should be given back. And in a way, I've been a part of this consensus. I've publicly said it, I wrote it, I was part of several commissions that were formed by the government around the committee and the institution I'm heading, Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art, was part of the very few institutions that were interviewed by Bénédicte Savoy and Felwine Sarr, so I'm part of the whole thing. But nevertheless, I want to question this assumption, and what I'm going to say now is has to be taken as questions. I'm not saying anything definitive, and I'm not giving answers. I'm just putting a larger frame into the debate so that we can actually ask ourselves some questions about this kind of thing, which I think that we all are the same. When we are faced with something that seems to us unjust, we want to have some kind of balance and justice coming back. But then we have to go beyond these feelings, these immediate responses, without saying that they're necessarily wrong, but just questioning them. I'm sorry, I'm in a way, I'm not, yeah, maybe I'm more, yeah, I know, I believe in dialectics or something like that. And maybe, again, this is very old-fashioned European and all that, but I do believe in that. I do believe that reason is something valuable, and I do believe that reason is built through discussion and contradiction and how you deal with that. Yeah. So one perspective, for instance, is to consider the fact that looting and displacement of objects of art has been going on for centuries, if not more than that. And I take just one example because it's a very similar example to something else. These are two works by one of the best late Greek sculptor, Boetos of Chalcedon. These works were made in Athens in the 1st century BC, 2nd century BC. They were considered masterpieces. They are signed, and they are signed saying that these are important works. I mean, the Herm is signed, not the Agon. They were looted by a Roman consul, Sulla, in Athens when he sacked Athens in 86 BC. Then they were sent to Rome because it was customary at the time, and you can find it in Cicero and other writers too, that when the Roman armies would attack a specific city, they were not speaking about countries, they were taking away what's valuable to bring it back to Rome. So everything was sent back to Rome, but a tornado came, I mean not a tornado, a tempest came, and there was a shipwreck. The shipwreck didn't happen near the Greek coast or the Roman coast. The shipwreck happened near what is currently Tunisia. In 1907, French archaeologists discovered the shipwreck. And they excavated it and placed it into a museum which was not created by France, which was actually created by the Bey of Tunisia in the 1980s, before France came into Tunisia. So it's a museum, the Musée National du Bardo, which is not a colonial institution, but which is something that is done by a pre-colonial state, a real state, even though it was formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire, before the French took over. And of course, it was transformed by the French. Then, because of the special relationships that happened between France and Tunisia, it's not without any problem, but the relationship was not the same ones as with Morocco or Algeria. France, when independence was declared in 1954, didn't take everything back to France, just left it there, and there was a strong cooperation for forever. So now there are jewels of the Bardo Museum, a museum that has been attacked by a strong identitarian folly, making several dead people in the museum itself in 2015. So should we say that because the thing has been looted by a Roman general, it should go back to its country of origin? Or should we say that it's a good thing that this thing is in Tunisia, that it can be part, because it's not going as if nothing happened, that it can be part of a more general discussion in Tunisia and maybe in Northern Africa about, again, something like multiculturalism or something like that, that has not necessarily everything to do with liberalism or neoliberalism, but also with democracy and a fight against a kind of narrow identity. Second example, and it's voluntarily even more problematic, among the objects, and certainly among the great artworks, and maybe this is something we have to be clear about, that is claimed by Benin, that has been looted by the French military in Abomey, is this statue of the god Gu, which has been extremely influential in French art history. And I don't know whether I'm using the word French art history also to say that French art history, contrary to maybe what we just heard, I'm not sure that the fact that it's international makes it less imperialistic or less colonial, because French art has always been, okay, Picasso is French, everybody knows that, and that's clear. And it's been like that for a very long time. So I don't know whether we gain something in that, but anyway. So one of the problems is, what is the provenance of this object before it came into the Abomey Palace? It's very difficult to say, because if you read, there are several art historians who wrote about this sculpture, and most of the time, the only source they can quote is oral sources that are, of course, interviews that were given starting in the 1950s or 1940s about the object, which say, from people who say, oh yes, but this was stolen from somewhere else, or this was done by somewhere else. The latest article I read in Gradiva was, in this sense, pretty, to me, fantastic, because it went through interviewing someone 3 years ago who said, no, in fact, it was not made by another northern tribe, as has been said. My great-grandfather told me that, in fact, it had been made in Abomey by a foreign an artist from another tribe, so not a Dahomey artist. But, all that is pretty complicated. But again, so if, should it be the decision of the country where we, as French, give it back? Because my guess is that at least all these Benin works that France has, there was it's one of the very few state claims by Benin in 2016, and France answered this claim by saying, no, we cannot give anything back. We would like to, but we can't. And my guess is that maybe this afternoon in France, the president of the Republic is going to say, yeah, we are giving this back and other things, and I don't know what he's going to say, but as there's a general consensus about that. But then does it mean that the Benin state, the current Benin state, has to investigate whether this is from the national collections or whether it was seized from another kingdom which is not part of the national community now and might not be, I don't know anything about that, might not be on the national territory of current Benin that anyway was described, as Pedro said, by the colonial power or powers in Africa through the 1885 Berlin Treaty that basically divides Africa between the various European countries. I just want to bring in cases which maybe have nothing to do with repatriation in a way, or maybe have to do with that, but which are very complicated in terms of who is the right owner. As you know, the heads from the bronze heads from the Summer Palace in Beijing have been a question for a long time, and have been the Chinese government and a lot of art historians and museum officials have pleaded for these works to be returned to China because they were stolen by the French army, and it's very clear, again, it's very documented, in 1860. And because of the way China works, basically it didn't go through this process of a general discussion or anything. It went through buying them back from European collections, either on the French market or on the Hong Kong market, and taking them back to China to show them. So 4 out of the 12, the set is not complete yet. Some of the heads are missing. Have been bought by the Poly Corporation to be included in the Poly Art Museum. And the idea is to go beyond that. What I find very interesting is the fact that these are not, in a way, if we stick to these kind of nationalistic ideas, these are not Chinese artifacts. They were made by one French and one Italian Jesuit priests who were in Beijing at the time. And when I say made by, then I have another problem. Of course, they were conceived by, and maybe not made by. So it's, I guess that the artisans were actually, the craftsmen were actually Chinese. So who is in fact the creator? Who is the national owner if we stick to these ideas? One counter way is to think about art as not belonging to a specific country. And I know that in a way this is extremely old-fashioned, that it takes, not for nothing, but not for the principle, the idea that it is a financial and symbolic resource for a nation state or for an owner, but the idea that there is a way in which we can think about artworks as things that are displaced in principle and that circulate in principle. And this would lead to, of course, some restitutions, some circulations, but maybe in a different way than the ones we are facing. Let me stay with China and the relationship with the rest of the world, because we always are told that museums are a European idea, a European institution, and that the idea of a universal museum, which I don't adhere to anyway, but I'm going to use this phrase just for the sake of simplicity, is a European one. But you do find in, for instance, Persian collections, Turkish collections, works, artifacts that were considered artworks and prized as such from a lot of different origins. So I'm just showing you 4 pages of an album, which is the equivalent of a museum because it's only dealing with art on paper, that was assembled by Dost Muhammad for the Safavid prince Bahram Mirza and is in Tabriz. So you have images from the Ming dynasty coming from China, and in the same album you also have images that were made by Italian artists from the same period, Gentile Bellini, but also Turkish artists or Persian artists copying Italian artists, or Turkish artists, Safavid artists, working in their own style, and all this being mixed together in a way. So it's not necessary that as art historians we stick to the idea that there's only, that the national is the only valid criteria. And I'm struck by the fact that a lot of time when you are dealing with the way, how would I phrase it? I want to phrase it nicely, and it's going to sound ugly. When post-colonial studies go into art history, they bring back notions that art history has been fighting for decades, like nationalism, ideas of influence. We heard this word just before me. Or these kinds of ideas, or the authority of the creator, or things like that, which is very strange to me. And because I do think that post-colonial studies have something else to say to art history, and something much more important, and that would go along what a lot of art historians have been trying to do for a long time. So maybe this is not a good example, and maybe I was not planning to speak too much about that, but so we don't have to be faithful to Vasari's idea of the national context as being the only relevant one. And maybe we can look more at people like Wölfflin with in their own context. So I'm not saying that he was not nationalistic, that he was not Eurocentric. I'm not saying any of that. But pleading and working in a much more open way, which was, and it's pretty, for his time, 1915, it's the middle of the First World War, and his putting together works from various countries which are actually at war at the time in Europe, not going outside of Europe. This is, in a way, also the questions that are risen by the idea of what a museum should be. And again, these are a few questions I want to ask. As you know, maybe the epitome of the idea of a universal museum was formed around the Louvre in the 18th century, so starting in 1793 with the establishment of the Musée Central des Beaux-Arts, and with this idea that the Louvre had to get everything that was important for mankind. I'm cutting a long story short, and sorry for those of you who know the story better than I do, maybe. But what I want to stress and emphasize is the fact that the Louvre at the time was conceived as a museum for artists. The man who was responsible for conceiving the Louvre was Hubert Robert, the painter. He painted some views of the Louvre and envisioned its future in a way that was particularly gloomy, as you can see. But that's a very important thing, that museums were not conceived for tourists, and that in a way, they were not first conceived for fostering national identity, even if that in the end, they worked towards this identity. And it's very slowly that the idea that they were also made for education of the people in general was made important. It was first for artists, then for the education, and it only came much later than it was for nationalistic purposes and tourism even later. Which doesn't mean that there was no problem, on the contrary, but it's again something that has to be understood or taken into account in that aspect. When I say that they were not, I mean, it didn't go without any problems, as you might know. So the French Museum was first a national museum. So the idea was to bring into this museum everything of value that was in France, because at the time the French Revolution had made that possible. So it meant looting, so to speak, the various castles of the aristocrats, the churches all over France, and bringing what was considered most valuable in Paris, and leaving in the various provincial capitals what was less valuable in terms of what art history at the time considered interesting or not. Then when French Revolution, which was before the idea of a nation, the idea, I mean, it's the moment, of course, as you know, of the constitution of the idea of a nation, so it's not completely secure, completely clear. When French Revolution thought that it had to go beyond its national borders and invade Europe, and it invaded Europe to fight against kings and tyrants, and not to fight for the greatness of French nation that came afterwards with Napoleon. But the first idea was that. It's completely rotten, it's completely delusive, but it was fought for that. Then it meant bringing back artworks from Germany, artworks from Italy, artworks from Spain, in Paris, for a reason that was repeatedly assessed by various revolutionary people, which was free them from the tyrants and bring them into the only free country in the world, with the idea that once the whole world would be freed from tyranny, then it would be possible to have them moved back. At the time, there were strong opponents who, such as Quatremer de Chassey, who wrote against this very idea, saying the natural setting of Italian artworks is their churches, their palaces, and they should not be removed. And this is also coming, I mean, I think should come into the discourse nowadays. So maybe I'm ending very quickly with the status of African art objects. I don't know how to call them, but I like the idea that I prefer to be interested into artworks than just heritage or something like that. I am still thinking that some kind of hierarchies are possible. And again, I'm saying that as someone who curated exhibitions about punk and about Nicolas Poussin in a row in the same place. So I'm sort of, I think I do know at some point what I'm talking about. So of course, most of these African artworks were brought to Europe, not as artworks, but just as curiosities, just as objects of amazement or derision, and that was linked with the general colonial project. Slowly, they gained some kind of recognition, and it should be assessed that the kind of recognition that art objects from outside Europe gained is linked with the colonial project and linked with the way various parts of the world were colonized or were reached in a certain way. So, I mean, first Asia and then, and at the end, Africa or South Pacific. And they were valued as art objects only by artists, and this is also something very important, first by artists and not by the market or anything. And being valued by artists mean things that are very un-museum-like, as you can see in this photograph of the collection of so-called tribal art by Picasso just after his death, which is basically a heap of things and not anything else. Then they were valued by intellectuals, and they were valued as art objects, again, and with a kind of broadening of the art object. I know, I'm finishing. I'm just using the French thing because my colleague only spoke 20 minutes. No, I'm not going to speak for 20 more minutes, but don't worry. And in the whole work of Georges-Henri Rivière, I think there is something very interesting in the way of broadening the definition of an artwork, maybe losing at one point voluntarily the idea that these are artworks in terms, and to focus on ethnography and all that. But during the 30s or the 20s, it was valued as that. And I show also this image just to bring back into, I forgot to say that one of the ideas behind Macron's talk was the idea that France was now multicultural in the sense that there was a large immigrant population of immigrant origin, which has been something going on for a long time, but which is somehow clearer now. And that in speaking about this circulation, we should not forget about how the current situation of a country is different from the previous one. And I'm just showing this image because, of course, in this discourse, the figure of Josephine Baker is someone very interesting. I think that things, in a way, got wrong with this other Frenchman. It's the moment when we thought that artworks were not important and that they were only images, and that we could shift images anywhere, that we could have replicas that would be as good as the actual objects, and that maybe the actual objects was interesting only because of its auratic presence. We know how much Malraux stole from Benjamin, and not because a concrete object brings a concrete experience with it. And I'm struck by the fact that a lot of discussion around restitutions or circulations are entangled with this idea that maybe we can keep some replicas and send the actual works. And we heard today about replicas, and I think it was very interesting in that sense. Or that we can send replicas and keep the actual objects, or things like that, which is the thing that is emerging in France in reactionary circles. And I do think, in a way, and again, maybe I'm old-fashioned, that I do believe that it's through actual artworks that we can have experiences that can be more enriching, that maybe some of them would lead to repatriating some actual objects. And that's why, I go back to the initial idea I had for this presentation, which was to speak about why do we care so much about representation when dealing with artworks? Why did we get away with this idea that might be completely Eurocentric, phallocentric, I don't know, that what matters is the actual one-on-one relationship with an object, image, which is meaningful to you, which makes you think, which makes you feel something, which transforms you. And there are a lot of issues around the project of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, a lot of problems in the actual realization of the museum, but one of the things that struck me when seeing it was the fact that when you do have major artworks together, such as Benin bronzes and paintings, and major ones, not anyone would do, but major ones, and I'm sorry again to bring in this idea that hierarchy is useful in that sense. And we do all live through hierarchy. We're doing away with hierarchy, but then we're saying, this film is great, this film is not. This painting is, makes me go to a museum, and this one does not. So I do think that there are still relevant ideas. So if you have a major painting by Poussin and a major painting by La Hire, with exactly contemporary, or more or less contemporary, because we don't know the dates, the exact dates, of some Benin bronzes, then something happened that could not happen just through putting images together, as in Malraux's project. And maybe that's where I would want us to go further, rather than this kind of clash of images. Thank you.